Thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of the research webinar series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructure for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of MVU, the Michigan Virtual University, which is a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of Michigan Virtual School, a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school, Michigan LearnPort, an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, and MyBlend, a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. Before we introduce today's presenter and the topic of their presentation, an important disclaimer for our research webinar series. This webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and/or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, and are not given nor endorsed by MVU or MVLRI unless otherwise specified. Today's presenter is Jered Borup, who is an assistant professor in the Division of Learning Technologies at George Mason University. Dr. Borup earned his PhD in Instructional Psychology and Technology from Brigham Young University in 2013. Previous to earning his PhD, Jered taught history at a junior high school for 6 years. He has taught online and blended courses since 2008. In his current position, he is working to build the integration of online learning in schools' master's and certificate program, which began its first cohort in fall of 2014. He recently served as a fellow for George Mason's Office of Distance Education and led an initiative that prepared faculty for the challenges of online instruction. His current research interests include developing online learning communities and identifying support systems that adolescent learners require to be successful in online environments. Over the past 8 months, we have been honored to have Jered serve as an MVLRI Fellow, focusing on helping on-site mentors to understand and fulfill their responsibilities for online learners. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jered.
Thanks, Catherine. I should say that I have a little bit of a cough, so I've got a glass of water here, but it shouldn't get out of hand, hopefully. We've got a small enough group. I'm wondering if everyone would just introduce themselves in the chat window, maybe your current position or your involvement with online or blended learning. And as you do that, I did place some links to the presentation at the top of the chat window and to the framework that I'll be presenting on as well, a pre-publication draft of the paper. Okay, welcome, Laura. That's great. I know Joe and Kristen and Catherine. Oh, IDLA, great. I taught in Idaho Falls for 6 years. I taught history at what's now Compass Academy. So. BSU is a great program, so that's great. Okay. Yeah, Northern Idaho is beautiful. I've only been there once, but it's great. Yeah, there's kind of northern Idaho and then southeast Idaho. They're two very different areas. Both are beautiful, but it's good to have someone from Idaho. Okay, so I'm actually in Fairfax, Virginia right now, which is just outside of DC, if you're not familiar with that. So we're actually pretty close. Michelle, welcome. That's a great experience. Okay, so it feels like we have a very experienced group with online learning. What I'm mostly going to be talking about is a framework that we developed, and this is actually part of my dissertation. So I did a 3-article dissertation, and this was my 3rd article. Like I said, you can access the article here. And the co-authors, Dr. West, Graham, and Davies, were all on my committee. I'm going to start the presentation with a metaphor that David Witten used in a presentation that he gave that I attended when I was a grad student. And although this article was published in 1989, it's really relevant, and I say it's a must-read. It's 6 pages. But I love it, and I've read it multiple times, especially when I was writing this framework. And he also gave a video lecture that I highly recommend watching. I didn't actually go to this lecture, but it is available here. I'll go ahead and put it in the window. So later on, if you want to bookmark that and then watch it later. But I'm going to use a metaphor that he used. So here's an image. What are we looking at here? So maybe if you can type in and give your best guess. Any guesses of? Yeah, okay. Excellent. Gold star for you guys. Definitely a conference social hour. Definitely social hour. Everyone has their drinks. They got their badge or their name tags. Kind of an icebreaker. Notice everyone is engaged in a conversation except for this guy. And I think we've all been there, right? You go to the conference and maybe you're not familiar with the conference. It might be your first time. And so it can be a challenge for him. And his goal is obviously to join a conversation. So the question is, how do you join a conversation? There are some strategies, right? Hopefully you went to some presentations, maybe you recognize some people, or you went to the keynote, so then you kind of know the topic of what's going on in the conversation. But a lot of times you just kind of kick back and listen for keywords, things that interest you. And then once you hear something, then you can kind of sit back, maybe introduce yourself, and then wait for the right time to add something. And so once you really understand what the conversation is about, then you have the opportunity to add something significant to the conversation. Well, research acts is really similar to that in the sense that if you're new to a research area, it can be a challenge to get into the conversation, and it takes a lot of work. It takes some time. But what you want to do is find where the conversations are happening, and then listen or read what the research is, and then at the right moment you can add something significant to the conversation. But before you join the conversation, you need to understand the framework. All these conversations are organized around a theoretical framework, typically. And so once you've found that framework, that's really your gateway into the conversation. So there are types of frameworks. And so this book chapter is actually a framework to understand frameworks. How meta is that? But this is another one I recommend reading, so I'm going to put the link right there if you're interested. This is a pre-publication draft that you can look at. But in this draft, Graham says that there's three. I'm going to highlight two types of frameworks. He first says that there are explore frameworks. And really what an explore framework is, let me get an arrow here. You have defining frameworks, so you have distinguishing attributes of something that you're interested in, a variable. And so you might have distinguishing attributes of variable A and then variable B, and then what you're trying to do is show the shared attributes to that. Another way to look at that is you might have kind of an umbrella term. So for instance, you might have blended learning, and then underneath that you would have different types of blended learning, so kind of distinguish attributes for each of those different types. So that's kind of an explore framework. What it does is it tries to organize things so that it's a little more understandable. Another type that is less common is explain frameworks. And what you're really trying to do here is you've got two variables and you want to, you understand those variables, but now what you want to do is explain how they're related. So one example of that is with the Community of Inquiry framework. If you're familiar with that, they basically say that student performance is positively correlated with cognitive presence, social presence, and teaching presence. So one nice thing about explain frameworks is you can actually put forth some hypotheses and then you can allow people to test them to see if they're accurate or not. Whereas with explore frameworks, you can kind of expand or contract those, but it's not really highlighting relationships to kind of outcome variables or target variables. So why are we even interested in frameworks? There's 6 primary reasons that I find. One is to understand current practice. You want to know what's going on to kind of make sense of the world. But also, by using frameworks, you can identify alternatives. So you might not be seeing the ideal type of blended learning or online learning, but with a framework, you can kind of see the potential or what's possible. Frameworks also allow you to know the, excuse me, the relevant questions to ask with your research. You can also, it can help you to know what types of data to collect and also how to collect them. A lot of times if we're doing interviews, for instance, you can organize your interview protocol based on the framework. And also it just kind of provides a research agenda for you personally, but also for the field. It can kind of help the field to organize a common research agenda and effort to better understand a certain phenomenon. So I don't know if you've ever looked at PhDcomics.com, but I loved it when I became a PhD student. But so these are sentences you'll probably never read in a published paper. One that I really wanted to highlight was this. You know, we just thought it would be a neat thing to do. That definitely happens in research, and it happens a lot. But when you do that, you're not really joining the conversation. A lot of times you're just kind of talking to yourself. And so if you have a framework, you avoid this tendency, well, this looks interesting and the data is there and it's easy to get, so I'm going to go ahead and write a paper on it. I don't know if you've ever watched, I know this isn't a scholarly movie, but Dumb and Dumber, the original one where he's at the 7-Eleven and people are drinking big gulps. And he walks up to him and he says, "Big gulps, huh? Well, see you later." And he kind of walks off. Well, he didn't actually know what they were talking about, didn't know what to add to the conversation. So he just said something and then walked off. And I think a lot of research is kind of like that, where we just kind of say, well, big gulps, this is interesting, and then walk off, and then you don't go back to it, and no one else really goes back to it either. So frameworks can help to avoid that. So here we are. This is us. There's a strong conversation going, and we want to join this conversation. So let's talk a little bit more about strategies to do that. Like I said before, you really want to know what the frameworks are. You want to find those, who's being cited, so you want to find that. But then once you've done that, you can ask yourself, what's missing from the conversation? So it might be that, well, this framework is really designed for higher ed, but what about K-12? Or what about, this framework explains supplemental online programs. What about full-time? Things like that. And so you can pay attention to the conversation. Once you understood that, then you know what's missing. And David Witten, in his presentation, he talks about adding 20%. If you go into the conversation saying, you've got it all wrong, you really should be talking about X and you're talking about A. That's problematic as well, because you're trying to start a conversation and it's hard to do that. But if you accept 80% of what they're saying and then you can add your 20%, then you're really contributing to a conversation rather than trying to start a new one. But then what happens when you need to add more than 20%? And so that's one thing that we'll be talking about in this presentation. So I was wondering if you could just try to think about what's the conversation that most interests you. So maybe that's a challenge that you're kind of facing right now. So maybe if you could type in there, what conversation are you part of now that you're really interested in? Excellent, yeah. Accountability. Okay, great. Career readiness is one rationale that's used quite often. The culture, right? So one framework that kind of talks about that is kind of barriers to change, kind of first order and second order, if you've looked into that. Using technology strategically, good. Parental involvement, that's another area that I'm very, very interested in, is kind of this wraparound support around students to help them be successful, including the role of the parent. We'll talk about that as well. And I think that, Randy, I think that last part is really critical, measuring the effectiveness of engagement. And we'll also be talking about engagement as well here. So my framework talks about that a little bit. Great, so support systems for students, Lauren, I think that's perfect. Okay, so it feels like there's lots of overlap here to these conversations, and I think we'll touch on some of them. I can't remember if I've used this metaphor in a MVLRI webinar or not, but this is Secretary Arne Duncan. He plays basketball. He's quite good at it, actually. Played in Harvard. I think he played semi-professional for a while. This was the All-Star game in 2014. He was actually the All-Star for that game. But what's unusual about this is that his jersey number is 80, which is very uncommon. Normally it's in the 20s or maybe 40s, but not 80. And he chose 80 because that was, at the time, the on-time graduation rate in the nation. So typically it kind of hung around 75%. And this was the first significant increase in quite some time. But that was overall. So if you look at certain demographics, or if you look at, for instance, online or blended learning, the on-time graduation rate for full-time programs, or the completion rates for courses, it can be hard to know what they are. It's very difficult to know. And I know that Joe has been doing some great work at MVLRI trying to answer that question. Typically, it's lower, but one thing that I think we need to remember is that's an average. So on average, it tends to be lower, but if you look at specific programs, some are much, much lower than the average, and some can actually be higher. And so what I'm really interested in is finding out, why are successful programs successful? What are they doing differently? And so I started looking at this, like I said, for my dissertation. And one thing that's all over in the literature is that high school students tend to have an external locus of control. fewer self-regulation abilities or metacognitive skills, which makes it very difficult for them to learn in a new type of environment. So they have to relearn how to learn, but also to have that high level of flexibility can be quite challenging for them with low self-regulation. And because of that, they really require support from others. So the question or the conversation I really wanted to be part of was what are the support structures for K-12 online students, and also how do they help students be successful? So I really wanted to explore that, but also explain that. So I was really looking for an explain framework. So Rice wrote this in 2006, and basically said that in the field right now, there is an absence of theoretical rationale. And I understand that that was 2006, but sadly I'd say that that's still the case today. Very recently, over the last couple of years, there's been some interesting research that has been using frameworks, theoretical frameworks, but for the most part, things have been fairly exploratory, and a lot of that is just coming of age. You have to have that exploratory research, but eventually we really need to start using frameworks to have a concerted effort. So for my dissertation, what I looked at was, again, I was interested in support systems. I used Moore's 3 types of interactions. So here you have our learner right here. So what Moore did was, this was 1989. We were kind of, at that time, we were moving from an independent study model to more interactive models of distance education. Not really online learning yet, but here he said that we have learner-instructor interaction, we have learner-content interaction, and then learner-learner interaction. And he basically said that each of those have different purposes for the learner, or different benefits for the learner. He said that learner-content interaction was foundational for any educational experience, that you had to have that. The instructor could then help you to apply your knowledge and to customize the content for you and provide feedback when you're applying your knowledge. And then he said that learner-learner interaction can be very motivational, especially for younger students. But when we look at this, remember, we're talking about K-12 here. This was really created for higher education. Who are we missing from this conversation? What type of interaction could we or should we add? So maybe you could type in your guess there, or what your thoughts are. Yeah, I would definitely say parents are missing. So when we're talking about stakeholders, parents, good, and global community, good. So there are some. Someone later after Moore added learner interface, and then also learner community interactions as well. But this is important. With K-12 students, the parents play a critical role in education. But not only that, we also need to look at instructor-parent interactions. And really, this triangle here is what I was very interested in when I was doing my dissertation. So I kind of use this as my framework for examining interactions in support systems. And so what I did on this next slide, this is pretty much my dissertation in a couple tables. What I did was I was looking at Mountain Heights Academy now, or Open High School of Utah at the time. What we did was we surveyed parents and students just to try to get a sense for the levels of interaction and the qualities of those interactions. And so in this top table, what we're looking at is motivational value of these interactions. And so you can see over here we've got learner-parent, parent-instructor, learner-instructor, learner-learner, and learner content. So this is it motivational to you? And then we have percent agreed. And you can see that the highest is learner-parent interaction. But what was also interesting about this is when we asked parents the same thing, parents underrated their motivational impact on students. So one thing that we found is that parents don't necessarily understand the impact that they can have in student learning, which can be a barrier. We can also see that learner-instructor interaction is very motivational for them. And all of them are motivational. Like, we can't say 79% is low. But that was a little lower, and then learner content or learner was lower. Then we also asked, how do they benefit your learning, the content? And then we found, again, learner-instructor interaction was high, but learner-content interaction, as expected, was quite high. So kind of keep that in mind, and then I'm going to show you the third table here, and this is a correlation table. So I'm going to give you a minute and just kind of look at these. Hopefully it's big enough on your screen. But what do you... I put an asterisk next to the things that are significant, and again, correlations can go from -1 to +1, and depending on the strength. So a +1 is a strong positive correlation, so as one variable goes up, the other one goes up, and then a negative is as one variable goes up, the other one goes down. So here we have the types of interaction, and then over here we have the outcome. So student grade, perceived learning, satisfaction, disposition, perceived learning, and satisfaction of the parents. So do you notice any trends? Oh, sorry, Randy, that it's, yeah, I can imagine on a tablet it's already small on my desktop. And Catherine is letting her boss some heritage coming in. So by looking at this, the positive correlations are with the learner and learner, and then if we look at this, learner-parent interaction tends to be negative. One thing that was really surprising overall, and at the time, looking back, I think that I had a fairly simplistic view of this, but we just didn't find the significant correlations that we're hoping for. So even the positive, the significantly correlated items were not that strong. I mean, a 0.29 or 3.1, I guess, is the highest, and that's just not that strong of a correlation, right? So we started looking at this, and we had more questions than answers, I think, and it was very helpful, though, and insightful to ask those questions. But we really wanted to know what is going on with the parents, because we didn't want to say that, you know, parents should not be involved in their student. If parents got out of the way, then learners would do better, right? We didn't necessarily think that was happening. What we thought was happening was that parents were retroactively kind of helping learners once there was already a problem. And if you had a lot of that going on, then you would kind of expect those students doing poorly would have more parent interaction than you might see some of these negative correlations. And also we thought that, remember in the previous slide, learner-learner interaction, they said that it wasn't very motivational and that it wasn't very educational for them. But then we start seeing all these positive correlations here. So one thing that we kind of thought was maybe learner-learner interaction wasn't required, so only those students that were very engaged in the course were going in there and participating with other learners and being part of that community. So we thought that maybe this was a spurious correlation. And then learner content interaction, we start seeing some negative or very, very low correlations. And so one thing about online learning is that once you get it, you're done. But if you need to spend more time, so if you're really struggling and need to spend more time with the content, then you can do that. And so although you have to remember that we're measuring minutes and pretty much minutes and hours that they were spending in these correlations. And so one thing that we walked away with was that we were really using the wrong framework to look at support systems, that we walked away with lots of questions. And we used an explore framework, and what we really needed was an explain framework. And so we looked at the community of inquiry framework. I think, Randy, in the last presentation, you mentioned that you use this framework or are very familiar with it. They've got a great website that I recommend going to. This was developed in 2000. This is really when text discussion boards were very popular, and people are trying to figure out how to use that. And the whole framework was kind of emerged out of this environment, and it wanted to see if you could establish social presence in an online environment. Social presence is the ability to establish yourself as a real person, full personality, and also how teachers can direct conversations in discussion boards, and then how students learn, or kind of the cognitive presence. Their target variable was an educational experience, but they never really defined that very well. And so in the research, what really happens is that the outcome variable that's talked about isn't really the educational experience, it's kind of cognitive presence. So people kind of think, well, how does teaching presence impact cognitive presence, or how does social presence impact cognitive presence? So the framework is, thank you for sharing the link, Randy, that's helpful. The framework is extremely helpful, and it's been cited who knows how many thousands of times, but it's been very impactful. But for me, what I was looking at for support systems for K-12 online learning, it really wasn't, I mean, it was insightful, but it wasn't really what we're looking for. And Archer, who was one of the original authors of the 2000 article of the main framework, in 2010, so 10 years after the framework was established, he says that the use of the community of inquiry framework has been largely restricted to analysis of online discussions. And that's where it kind of emerged, and it kind of stayed there for at least a decade. And I'd say even now it's kind of stayed there. And Archer said that we really need to expand this framework. But when he did that, he said, in order to broaden the scope, we need to have a new look at the overall rationale for the framework. So you really need to break it down and rethink it, is what he was saying. So one big gap that I thought was here was that they don't talk about parents, and really, why would they? They were talking about higher education. And so when I was looking at this, I knew that parents were important. I wasn't really seeing where they belonged in this framework. And not only that, I wanted something larger than just kind of cognitive presence or discussion boards and things like that. So this was helpful, but I really wanted to look at parents. So then I looked at Epstein's 6 types of involvement. So her framework kind of emerged from a elementary face-to-face school setting, and this was, again, very helpful. I also love apparently you have to have a Venn diagram for these frameworks. So what she did was she had 6 types of involvement. Oh, great, Michelle. So you're I should just turn over the mic to you. Basically, 6 types, so parenting, communicating, volunteering, learning at home, decision-making, and collaborating with the community. And then each of these have different indicators for each of these types of involvement. And they kind of, I think she started at 4 and then expanded to 6. Michelle, you can correct me if I'm wrong. So I thought that was helpful. Then I also looked at Hoover, Dempsey, and Sandler's model. So this is a little more recent, where Epstein was more of an explore framework. Hoover, Dempsey's model was more of an explain framework. So if you look at this, they basically wanted to know why parents got involved, and what their choices that influenced them being involved. So their skill or demands on their time or invitations from the school, and then mechanisms for impacting their student learning, so modeling, reinforcing, instructing, things like that. So this was a little more of an explain model, and this was very insightful as well. But again, this was designed for a face-to-face context, and really elementary and middle school, and I was more interested in high school online. So after looking at these 4 different frameworks, they were all helpful, but in the end, I decided that these were not the frameworks I was looking for. That Witten basically talked about that there are boundaries of generalizability, and I felt like what I was interested in and really looking at support systems for K-12 online learning, really adolescent K-12 online learning, this was beyond those boundaries of generalizability. It was beyond the 20% that you'd normally add. And so because of that, what we did was we created the Adolescent Community of Engagement framework. So we use all of those frameworks that I was just talking about, and then we use the current literature in the field to kind of build on that and adapt those, and in the end, created our framework. And I want to key on the word adolescent because we were not, yes, Eric Black, Catherine, thanks for sharing that. So he used Hoover Dempsey's model, and he had his dissertation, but also some articles on there too. So McNeil talked about how some types of engagement that are beneficial for younger students can actually be damaging to adolescent students. And so we only really felt like we could create a framework for one or the other. And I was more interested in adolescent learning, and that's really where the growth was happening and is happening in K-12 online learning. So we identified 4 types of engagement. So we have student engagement, and that was really our target or outcome variable in the framework. Then we have teacher engagement, parent engagement, and peer engagement. So I just want to start with student engagement. Engagement is something that you hear all the time. People will throw out the term engagement quite often. And I always have to stop and think, well, what type of engagement are you talking about? Quite often, what they're talking about is behavior, right? But there's also different types of engagement. And so when I was looking at the articles or literature, these are 6 that I'm highlighting, but there's obviously more. And I started seeing some trends. So for instance, they all talked about cognitive engagement. And then there's also this psychological or affective or emotional engagement. And then over here, we also saw a lot of behavioral engagement. So what are they physically doing? Randy, I still do it, so don't worry about it. And then also, a lot of these can be collapsed. So when Appleton talked about behavioral and academic engagement, what they're really saying is what Chapman was just calling behavioral engagement. So we kind of collapsed some of these, and what we came up with is with student engagement, we saw that there were 3 sides of engagement. And the first side was behavioral engagement. This is typically what people are talking about when they say engagement, is like hands-on learning, things like that. And quite often, this is the easiest type of engagement to measure, right? I mean, you can observe it, you can see it. And especially in online learning, for instance, turning in an assignment, that is behavioral engagement. Or view counts or pages clicked and things like that. So LMS systems will record behavioral engagement quite often. The other 2 types are frankly very difficult to measure. You have cognitive engagement, so you can give assessments, so that's really what you're trying to get at if students participate in the assessments, right? Probably the hardest part to measure is affective engagement. This is student motivation. So not only what did they click on, but why did they click on that? How did they feel when they watched that video or when they participated in that learning activity, when they collaborated with their peers? I'd say affective engagement is the hardest to find or to measure. So we really ended up calling this the ABCs of engagement to kind of help us remember that and help other people remember that. And I think, this webinar is a good example to measure that. I could give you a quiz so I could kind of measure your cognitive engagement or see how you're enjoying the webinar. But for the most part, your behavioral engagement is quite low. You are making comments and things like that, but this isn't necessarily an environment where you'd have high levels of behavioral engagement. So remember, that was our target variable, so we ended up putting that in the center of our model. And the excuse me, the area of the triangle represented the amount of student engagement. That'll make a little more sense in a minute. And then we started putting the other kind of types of engagement around that target variable. So now we have parent engagement, and you have low, high. So this measures the amount of student engagement. And what we found was that there were different indicators of parent engagement. So for instance, facilitating interaction, nurturing relationships with students, caring for them, providing for their basic needs is critical, obviously. There's lots of literature to support that. Monitoring and motivating, especially if the student is learning at home, to monitor their physical behavior, but also going into the system and seeing what they're doing while they're at the computer, right? And then when they notice opportunities to motivate students, that they engage in those types of behaviors. But also volunteering their time at the school, or especially with full-time programs, they have parent organizations where you can volunteer for that. Also organizing, so again, teachers organize the virtual environment, and then parents can organize a physical environment. And also help them to create micro-learning schedules. So teachers typically set the due dates, if the program has due dates or hard due dates. But then also parents can help them to organize their time to meet daily goals, or they can break up that larger task into smaller tasks. And then instructing, and obviously parents are not content experts, or I should say typically not content experts. But remember, when students take an online course, there's really two things that they're learning. They're learning the content, but they're also learning how to learn. And parents can definitely support them in that. So they can instruct them on how to learn, or how to contact the instructor or communicate online and things like that. So again, when parent engagement is high, then we believe that student engagement will also be high. Also, in addition to parent engagement, we have teacher engagement. And you'll see that a lot of these are quite similar. So we have facilitating interaction with teachers. So they nurture relationships, but in a different way. So they try to build a classroom community. They're also monitoring and motivating. But again, it's very difficult for them to monitor what's going on offline. So parents really fill that gap. And also encouraging communication. So they play a critical role in kind of making sure all the participants are being involved and they know what's going on. We also have organizing and designing. So oftentimes the online teacher is not the primary designer, but they can make tweaks, or they can change discussion prompts, things like that. And then obviously teaching and tutoring, especially in an online environment. And I should also note that teacher engagement can be performed by multiple individuals. So you might have the online teacher doing some of that, and then you might have the on-site facilitator or mentor doing another part of that. So that's important to remember. And again, we believe that's positively correlated. And then you have peer engagement. We really, in the literature, we found two types. So instructing and collaborating, and they're very similar, except that instructing is more like peer tutoring, and collaborating is when you're kind of at the same level and then you're working together to achieve a goal. And then motivating, although peers might not understand that they have a motivational impact on their peers, they do. And so sometimes they do it intentionally, and sometimes it's unintentionally. I just saw your comment, Randy. I'm glad I got some affective engagement here. And again, that is positively correlated. So the other thing that I really want to touch on is that with the community of inquiry framework, it had social presence as one of the main circles in the three Venn diagram. We view social presence and modeling, for that matter, as enabling elements, meaning we didn't have them as a separate part of the framework, but we see it throughout the framework. And really it enables teachers to have an impact on students. It enables peers to have an impact on students. And also it enables more parent-teacher collaboration as well. So we view those as enabling elements. So that was the last article in my dissertation. And so for the last really 3 years, I've been working with Mountain Heights Academy to explore if this framework is really valuable to look at the support systems at this school. This is a full-time online charter school for high school students. It's just recently expanded down to some middle school grades. But over this time, we've conducted 60 interviews with teachers, parents, and students. We're just now kind of wrapping up our analysis of teacher interviews and have some publications with that. We're in the process of analyzing the parent and student interviews. But again, this is very time-consuming if you've ever done qualitative research. And so it hasn't been happening as fast as we would like. But we are finding some opportunities to expand and contract the model. So for instance, one thing that we found is missing with parent engagement is encouraging communication. We didn't have that there. And we're also finding that volunteering might be important, but maybe we don't need that in the model. It doesn't have to be a comprehensive list. And so we're finding that is kind of important, but maybe not the most important thing. We also want to look at this with additional context. So with MVLRI, I've had a great opportunity to work with their team to kind of explore mentors or on-site facilitators and kind of this model of learning where you have an online teacher and then you have students. Here's our teacher. And then you've got students in lots of different schools in a single online course, and then at each site or each school you have a mentor to kind of work with the students, and then you also have parents, obviously, or guardians that the mentor can work with. So the mentor plays a critical role, and we acknowledge that in the ACE framework, but I think we really need to see if the ACE framework is helpful for examining this, and if it is, then that could really help us to know what to look for. The other thing that I think was really interesting is there is a doc student at Brigham Young University that is actually looking at independent study, and he's using the framework for that. And I was kind of surprised by that, because when I designed the framework, it was really for this more collaborative learning environments. But what he wants to know is how do students form their own communities of engagement, right? So maybe it doesn't have to be school provided or program provided, and school and independent study students that are successful, maybe what they're doing is that they're kind of constructing this community of engagement on their own or with parents or things like that. And so that's what his dissertation is going to be, and I'm really interested to see how that goes. But I think we really need to look at lots of different environments. The other thing to remember with this research is that case studies can help to refine or expand frameworks, but they shouldn't be seen as testing frameworks. And so that I don't say that I'm testing the framework, but we have been successful at refining or expanding the framework. And eventually what we'd like to do is to have ways to quantitatively measure the different types of engagement, and then that would open up all sorts of research questions that we could ask. So that's kind of our end goal, but we're looking at the qualitative research as a way to, as a means to get there. You can have a full list of my publications here if you're interested. Again, this presentation is located here, and then you can ask me questions. But I think we have time if anyone has questions that they'd like to ask now.
Hey, Jered, this is Catherine from MVLRI. I had a quick question about the shepherding program. I know one of your publications is on that program. Is that still going on at Mountain Heights? And if so, how, or if not? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the shepherding program, let me actually go up to, so Mountain Heights Academy had a shepherding program. Because they were a fully online school, they couldn't have on-site mentors, but they recognized the need to have kind of a facilitator because the online teacher was feeling kind of overwhelmed trying to form close relationships with all their students. And so what they did was they created kind of a virtual homeroom where they assigned students to teachers, preferably one of their teachers, and then that teacher would work to build relationships with that student and their parents, and then that teacher could be a point of contact if students were having issues. Kind of the unintended consequence of that they experienced was that teachers felt like, well, I'm creating these relationships with it was called the shepherding program, so they called them their sheep, which I don't, or with these students. And because of that, I know that they're getting that attention from their shepherd, and so maybe I don't need to work very hard to create relationships with my other students. And so kind of the unintended consequence of that was that they actually saw kind of a drop in community. And so for now, they kind of went away from that model and basically said that you should create relationships with all of your students. One thing that really makes that more feasible for them is that they keep their student loads relatively low. I mean, in some programs you see quite a lot, but with them, because it's a full-time program, they try to keep it around 100. I think the most I saw in my interviews was like 120. So again, that's very challenging, but a little more feasible. And I don't know if they're going to go back and kind of explore a way to offer some online facilitating. I think that eventually they will, but I haven't spoken to the director about that specifically. Randy,
Any additional questions? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
The screen that you were talking about, Randy? Okay, great. Well, thank you for coming, and thank you for your participation, everyone.
Great. If you'd like additional questions for Jered, please go ahead and put them in the chat box or email him at jborup@gmu.edu. I'm going to go ahead and move on to a couple of our upcoming events. First off, we have been asked to plan and host an online and blended learning research community meeting on the workshop day before the INACOL Blended and Online Learning Symposium. And that day would be November 8th. So in order to get your feedback on what you'd like that event to look like, we ask that you please fill out the survey provided here. I'm going to put that survey link in the chat box. And so that would really help us get our information together from the community to help build that event out. So we really appreciate any and all feedback you have there. We also have 2 other wonderful ways of sharing out your research, including our Virtual Viewpoints podcast and also our guest blogger program. Be sure to visit those links to find out more about those. We also have 2 upcoming webinars that we'd like to share. The first one is next week on April 15th, 2 p.m. Eastern, and it's about Mentors Matter. That's supposed to be matter, not meter. Advancing a community of support, and it's our folks here at MVU, Ken Durkin and Marcia Docks, that will be presenting on that. The following one is the next week on Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern, and it's about 8 trends in K-12 online and blended learning and their implications for research, Michael Barber and Tom Clark's newest book that just came out. And of course, you can always contact us at mvlri@mavu.org or our Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. And we're happy to have you here. Thank you so much again, and enjoy the rest of your day.